Placed upon the throne of Scotland, not by his own strength, but by the judgment of England's Edward I, John Balliol became a puppet king in the eyes of his people. His reign lasted only 4 years, marked by humiliation, deposition, and exile. John's story is the tragedy of a monarch who never truly ruled, a sovereign in name whose crown was forever bound by another man's will. John Balliol was born around the year 1249 into one of the most prominent families in the region of Galloway in southwestern Scotland. His father, John Balliol the Elder, was a powerful baron who commanded vast lands, while his mother, Dervorgilla of Galloway, was a figure of immense prestige and influence. It was through his mother that John inherited a tenuous yet vital connection to the royal bloodline of Scotland. Dervorgilla descended from David, Earl of Huntingdon, who was the brother of King William I of Scotland. Known as William the Lion, this distant but legitimate tie to the royal family would later form the fragile foundation of John's claim to the Scottish throne. Yet noble birth alone did not secure strength. The Balliols were respected, but their influence was often overshadowed by more dominant clans and houses. Unlike the Bruces, who were assertive in their ambitions, or the Commons, who held vast political sway, the Balliol family occupied an uneasy middle ground. They possessed wealth and lands, but not the kind of overwhelming military or political presence needed to seize power outright. John's upbringing was steeped in privilege, but also in expectation. Educated in the traditions of both Anglo-Norman nobility and the Gaelic aristocracy of Scotland, he grew up in a world shaped by feudal obligations, political marriages, and the constant tension between Scotland and its larger southern neighbor, England. His mother, Dervorgilla, was deeply pious and left behind a legacy of charity and devotion. She is remembered for founding Balliol College at Oxford University. From her, John inherited not only a sense of duty, but also a cautious temperament, one that would later make him ill-suited for the brutal demands of kingship. By the time he reached adulthood, John was a figure of wealth, prestige, and noble lineage, yet he remained politically vulnerable. Unlike warriors who earned their crowns through battlefield triumphs, or cunning statesmen who manipulated alliances, John's future depended on inheritance disputes and the favor of powers beyond his control. His noble birth, while opening doors, also marked him as a pawn in a larger game. This fragility would soon become painfully clear. Scotland was a kingdom where power was constantly contested, and every noble house guarded its claims with tenacity. The Balliols had a legitimate but distant line to the throne, a claim that meant little while the royal family remained intact. However, history was about to shift dramatically. The sudden death of King Alexander III in 1286 would leave Scotland without a strong ruler, and the Balliol name would be thrust into the dangerous spotlight of succession. John's background, at once noble and uncertain, positioned him in a perilous middle ground. He was not strong enough to stand independently, yet his lineage was sufficient to draw him into the storm of politics. The very qualities that defined him, his cautious temperament, his dependence on external favor, and his noble but contested bloodline, would later shape the tragic course of his reign. John Balliol entered history not as a conqueror, but as a man whose fate was determined by forces larger than himself. His noble birth gave him a crown, but that same fragile foundation ensured he would never hold it securely. The year 1286 marked a turning point for Scotland. King Alexander III, a monarch whose reign had brought stability and prosperity, died suddenly in a riding accident. His death threw the kingdom into a crisis that would ripple through decades of turmoil. The immediate heir was his granddaughter, Margaret, known to history as the Maid of Norway. At only 3 years old, Margaret was too young to rule, and her position was precarious. Efforts were made to secure her succession through careful diplomacy. A marriage was arranged between Margaret and Edward of Caernarfon, the future Edward II of England, in hopes of uniting the crowns peacefully. But fate intervened with cruelty. In 1290, as Margaret traveled from Norway to Scotland to claim her throne, she fell ill and died at the age of 7 before ever setting foot in her kingdom. With her death, the royal line of Alexander III was extinguished, and Scotland faced a dangerous vacuum. Into this void stepped a multitude of claimants, each determined to assert their right to the throne. More than a dozen nobles, including some of the most powerful families in Scotland, pressed their claims. Among the strongest were Robert Bruce, Lord of Annandale, and John Balliol. Both traced their lineage to David of Huntingdon, but through different branches. Bruce descended from David's second daughter, while Balliol traced his claim through the eldest. By the laws of primogeniture, Balliol's claim carried more legitimacy. But in the volatile world of medieval politics, legitimacy was not enough. Power often rested in the hands of whoever could secure the most allies. The crisis became known as the Great Cause, a contest not only of genealogy, but of political maneuvering. Scotland's nobles feared civil war, for the rivalries among claimants were fierce. To prevent bloodshed, they turned to an outside arbiter, Edward I of England. Known as the Hammer of the Scots, Edward was a monarch of formidable ambition and military might. The Scottish lords invited him to mediate the succession, believing he would provide a fair and decisive resolution. But Edward had no intention of acting as a neutral judge. He demanded that before he rendered judgment, the Scottish nobles acknowledge him as overlord of Scotland. It was a condition that placed the kingdom's independence in jeopardy. Yet the desperate lords, anxious to avoid war, consented. Thus, the fate of Scotland was placed in the hands of a foreign king. In 1292, after years of hearings and deliberations, Edward declared John Balliol the rightful king. His decision was based on the principle of primogeniture, recognizing Balliol's claim as superior. On November 30th, 1292, John Balliol was inaugurated as King of Scots at Scone Abbey. Yet even as the crown was placed upon his head, John's sovereignty was fatally compromised. His throne was not secured by the will of his people or by his own strength, but by the decree of Edward I. From the very beginning, John's reign carried the stain of dependence. The Scots had avoided civil war, but at the cost of their independence, and their new king was seen by many not as a savior, but as a puppet. John Balliol, once a noble with a fragile claim, now bore the title of king. But the crisis of succession had revealed the true nature of his position. He had gained a throne, but the price was submission to the will of a foreign overlord. It was a bargain that would define his reign and ensure that history remembered him less as a ruler and more as a pawn. The coronation of John Balliol at Scone Abbey in November 1292 should have been the moment when Scotland embraced a new monarch, a man entrusted with leading the kingdom through a time of uncertainty. Yet the ceremony was overshadowed by the looming presence of Edward I of England. It was Edward's judgment that had elevated John above the other claimants, and it was Edward's authority that defined the fragile boundaries of John's reign. Almost immediately after John was crowned, Edward began to assert his supremacy over Scotland. He summoned John to his court in England and demanded that he acknowledge Edward as his overlord. The symbolism of this demand was devastating. For centuries, Scotland had struggled to preserve its independence from its powerful southern neighbor. To see their king bend his knee before Edward was, for many Scots, a betrayal of national sovereignty. Edward's control was not symbolic alone. He issued writs requiring John to appear in English courts as though he were a mere baron rather than a sovereign monarch. He demanded military support and taxes, treating Scotland not as a free kingdom but as a vassal state. Each demand eroded John's authority in the eyes of his subjects. The Scottish nobility, proud and fiercely independent, began to whisper among themselves that their new king was little more than a puppet. For John himself, the situation was deeply humiliating. He had not fought his way to the throne, and he had not seized it by force. His claim had been validated by legal precedent and by Edward's decision. Thus, from the outset, his kingship carried the stigma of dependence. To resist Edward openly was to risk losing everything. To comply was to lose the respect of his people. This delicate balance quickly became impossible to maintain. Edward's heavy-handed interference alienated not only John, but also the entire Scottish political class. The nobles who had initially accepted Edward's arbitration now realized they had opened the door to domination. Scotland was no longer a kingdom governed by its own institutions, but one under the shadow of English supremacy. The contempt of the Scots for their king found its cruelest expression in the nickname they gave him, Tum Tabard, meaning empty coat. It implied that John was a king in name only, a hollow figure draped in royal garments, but devoid of real power. This biting phrase would haunt his memory for centuries, reducing his reign to an image of weakness and subservience. The years following John's coronation were a parade of humiliations. Edward summoned him repeatedly, overturning decisions made by Scottish courts, demanding allegiance, and reminding everyone that John owed his throne to him. The King of Scotland, meant to be the guardian of his nation's independence, was forced into the role of subordinate. In truth, John Balliol was not entirely without options. He could have sought alliances, resisted Edward's demands, and rallied his people. Yet his temperament, molded by a life of cautious nobility rather than ruthless ambition, left him ill-prepared for such defiance. He was a man caught in the machinery of greater powers, ill-suited to confront the relentless will of Edward the Stirrer. The choice of Edward had placed John on the throne, but it also condemned him. He was not seen as the people's king, nor even as a ruler with the strength to defend their rights. Instead, he was the embodiment of dependence. A monarch whose reign was destined to be overshadowed by the man who had placed him there. John Balliol's reign, lasting only from 1292 to 1296, is remembered less for acts of leadership and more for the suffocating dominance of Edward I. The reality of his kingship was one of constant intrusion, a theater in which he wore the crown but held none of the strings. Edward demanded taxes from Scotland, as though it were already annexed into his realm. He required John to contribute soldiers for campaigns that had nothing to do with Scottish interests. Even the smallest of royal decisions risked being overturned if they conflicted with Edward's designs. The dignity of the Scottish crown was daily undermined, and John was reduced to a subordinate in his own kingdom. This dependence became glaringly clear in matters of justice. Scottish courts, traditionally sovereign within their borders, now found themselves overruled by English authority. Edward insisted that appeals from Scotland could be brought before his English courts, stripping away the last semblance of independence. For the proud Scottish lords, this was intolerable. For John, it was humiliating. The resentment of his subjects grew with each passing year. The nobles who had once accepted Edward's arbitration began to regret their decision. They had hoped for peace, but instead they saw their kingdom shackled. The common people, too, understood that their king was powerless. The nickname Tomb Tabard spread like wildfire, and John became a symbol of impotence. In council meetings, he was often overshadowed by louder and more determined voices among the nobility. His attempts at asserting authority were either ignored or swiftly crushed by Edward's interventions. Every time John tried to stand as a monarch, he was reminded of the strings that bound him. His throne was no more than a gilded cage. The situation grew worse when Edward demanded that Scotland support his war against France in 1294. For the Scots, who had long-standing ties with France through the Auld Alliance, this was an outrage. They were being forced to fight against a nation that had often been their ally, solely to serve the interests of England. For John, it was another moment when his crown became a burden. If he obeyed Edward, he would lose the loyalty of his nobles. If he resisted, he would face the wrath of the English king. Caught in this impossible dilemma, John faltered. His inability to resist Edward decisively eroded his legitimacy. He was king, yet he could not protect his kingdom from foreign domination. He was sovereign in name, yet every act of governance was shadowed by another's will. The tragedy of John Balliol's reign lies not in malice or cruelty, but in weakness. He was not a tyrant, nor a usurper, nor a villain. He was, instead, a man placed in a position too great for him, stripped of autonomy before he even began to rule. His subjects despised him, not because he had wronged them, but because he could not defend them. In these short years, the image of John as the empty coat hardened into legend. He was a king without a crown's power, a monarch without the means to govern, a sovereign whose throne was already hollow. Scotland, restless and humiliated, would soon rise in defiance. But for John Balliol, the fate of being a puppet was already sealed. By 1294, the uneasy balance between Scotland's fragile monarchy and Edward I's relentless domination had reached its breaking point. The spark was Edward's demand that Scotland contribute troops to his ongoing war with France. To the English king, this was nothing more than the expected duty of a vassal state. But to the Scottish nobility, it was an unforgivable humiliation. The Scots had long maintained the Auld Alliance with France, a bond of mutual defense against English aggression. To fight against France was to betray not only an ally, but also Scotland's independence itself. The order revealed, more clearly than ever before, that their king was nothing more than Edward's instrument. John Balliol found himself trapped between two impossible choices. To comply with Edward's demand would mean alienating the entire Scottish nobility. To resist would be to provoke the wrath of the most powerful monarch in Western Europe. His indecision, his inability to chart a bold path forward, became painfully obvious. The Scottish lords, unwilling to accept further degradation, decided to act without their king. In 1295, a group of 12 of the most powerful nobles formed what became known as the Council of 12. These men effectively seized control of the governance of Scotland, sidelining John and stripping him of even the pretense of authority. It was a stunning development. For the first time in centuries, Scotland had a king, but his own lords openly treated him as irrelevant. The council negotiated directly with France, reaffirming the Auld Alliance and seeking protection against English interference. In doing so, they ignored John Balliol entirely. John's humiliation was complete. He was not merely undermined by Edward, he was abandoned by his own nobility. In the eyes of his people, he was now a king in name alone, a monarch stripped of power even within his own palace. The nickname Tomb Tabard, the empty coat, took on an even sharper sting, for he truly wore the royal garments without the substance of kingship. At court, he was forced into the role of a silent observer. Decisions were made around him, without his input. Policies were enacted in his name, but without his approval. The king, who should have been the voice of Scotland, was reduced to a husk, a reminder of what the monarchy had once symbolized. The insult was personal as well as political. When the Council of 12 formally bypassed John, they were not merely rejecting his authority. They were declaring to the world that Scotland did not recognize him as a capable ruler. For a man raised to believe in the dignity of noble birth and the sacred duty of kingship, this was a wound deeper than exile or defeat. And yet, John endured it silently. There was no great outburst, no dramatic attempt to seize back power. He remained in place, wearing the trappings of sovereignty, but bereft of its reality. His reign, already fragile, became a theater of mockery. This period illustrates the core tragedy of John Balliol. He was not hated for cruelty, nor condemned for tyranny. He was despised for weakness. His subjects needed a leader who could stand against Edward I. But what they received was a man incapable of defiance, a figure reduced to watching helplessly as others acted in his name. The humiliation of 1294 to 1195 was not the end of John's ordeal, but it marked the moment when his kingship effectively ceased to exist. From this point forward, he was less a ruler and more a discarded emblem of a monarchy that had lost its independence. The crown upon his head no longer inspired loyalty or reverence. It provoked only pity and scorn. In 1296, the long-suppressed anger of the Scottish people finally erupted into open defiance. Edward I had pressed his demands too far, and the Council of 12, acting in the king's name but without his true authority, committed Scotland to resisting English domination. For John Balliol, this was both an opportunity and a trap. If he stood with his people, he risked Edward's vengeance. If he remained passive, he would confirm his image as a powerless puppet. At last, John attempted to act as a monarch. In early 1296, Scotland renounced its allegiance to Edward and declared its intention to stand independently. John's seal was placed on documents that formalized the alliance with France and asserted Scotland's sovereignty. On parchment, he appeared every inch a king. But in reality, the rebellion was not his own. The Scottish nobles led the charge, raising armies and rallying support. John was a figurehead, his presence necessary for legitimacy, but his leadership almost entirely absent. His attempt to step into the role of ruler came too late and lacked the conviction that might have salvaged his reputation. Edward's response was swift and merciless. In March 1296, English forces stormed the border town of Berwick-upon-Tweed. The massacre that followed was infamous. Thousands of inhabitants were slaughtered, the town burned, and the message clear: Edward would tolerate no defiance. For the Scots, it was a brutal awakening. For John, it was the prelude to disaster. In April, the two armies met at the Battle of Dunbar. The Scottish forces, though numerous, were poorly organized. John himself did not command the army. Leadership fell to his nobles, whose coordination was weak. Edward's seasoned troops crushed the Scots with devastating efficiency. The battle ended in catastrophe, and the rebellion collapsed almost overnight. The defeat at Dunbar sealed John Balliol's fate. Whatever legitimacy he had regained by standing with his people vanished in the face of military disaster. His reign, already marked by humiliation, now carried the stain of incompetence. He had failed to protect his kingdom, failed to inspire his subjects, and failed to resist the might of Edward I. The aftermath was brutal. English forces swept through Scotland, capturing castles, seizing treasures, and asserting dominance with iron authority. The symbols of Scottish independence were stripped away, and Edward's conquest seemed complete. For John Balliol, the rebellion that might have redeemed him instead destroyed the last fragments of his kingship. He had tried at last to be more than a puppet, but his attempt came too late and with too little force. His people needed a warrior king to lead them. What they had was a cautious noble caught in circumstances beyond his control. The uprising of 1296 was a turning point not only for Scotland, but also for John himself. It revealed the extent of Edward's power and the weakness of Scotland's monarch. For the Scots, resistance would continue under other leaders, men of fire and determination. For John Balliol, the defeat at Dunbar marked the beginning of his final humiliation, the public stripping away of his crown. The crushing defeat at Dunbar in 1296 not only destroyed Scotland's immediate resistance, but also shattered the last illusions of John Balliol's sovereignty. Edward I moved swiftly to ensure that John's reign ended in disgrace. The King of Scotland, once enthroned at Scone, was now reduced to a captive in the hands of his supposed overlord. Edward was not content with mere military victory. He wanted to humiliate John personally and symbolically. In July 1296, John was summoned to Edward's presence and forced to abdicate the throne. The ceremony was carefully staged to strip away every shred of dignity that remained to him. In front of English officials and witnesses, John was compelled to renounce his kingship. The most humiliating act came when Edward's men physically removed the insignia of royal power from his body. The royal robes were stripped from his shoulders, and the emblem of the Scottish crown was torn from his garments. This symbolic act transformed John from a sovereign into a man publicly branded as powerless. It was here that the nickname Tomb to Bard, empty coat, became literal. His coat of arms was ripped away, leaving him with nothing but shame. The image of a monarch reduced to an empty shell was seared into memory. He was no longer merely a puppet king. He was now a dethroned and disgraced prisoner. John's abdication was not an honorable resignation, nor a reluctant step aside for the good of the kingdom. It was a spectacle designed to demonstrate Edward's supremacy and Scotland's subjugation. The humiliation was complete. Scotland's king had been made to kneel, confess defeat, and surrender all authority. After his deposition, John was taken into custody. He was transported to the Tower of London, where he was held as a prisoner. The once hopeful heir of a noble family, the crowned monarch of a proud nation, was now confined behind stone walls, watched by guards, his every movement controlled. The Scots who had once looked to him for leadership now saw in him only weakness. His deposition confirmed their harshest judgments. He had been incapable of protecting their independence, incapable of resisting Edward, incapable of embodying the spirit of their nation. The shame of his abdication burned deeper than any battlefield loss. And yet, even in this humiliation, John remained passive. He offered no fiery speeches of defiance, no last stand of dignity. He simply endured, as he had endured throughout his reign. His silence spoke volumes, a tragic reflection of a man who had been forced into kingship and then destroyed by it. The spectacle of his deposition was not merely about John Balliol as an individual. It was a message to Scotland itself. Edward wanted the Scottish people to see their king broken, to believe that resistance was futile, and to understand that their nation was now subject to the will of England. In this moment, John Balliol ceased to exist as a monarch. He was reduced to a symbol of defeat, remembered not for leadership or heroism, but for submission and shame. His kingship, fragile from the beginning, ended in the most degrading way imaginable. After his forced abdication, John Balliol's life entered a long twilight of exile. Released from the Tower of London in 1299, he was permitted to retire to France, where his family held estates in Picardy. From that moment on, he lived not as a king in exile, plotting his return, but as a forgotten nobleman whose crown had been permanently stripped away. Unlike other dethroned monarchs who attempted to rally armies or conspire for restoration, John showed little appetite for reclaiming power. His temperament, molded by years of caution and passivity, left him unsuited to the role of an exiled claimant. Instead, he settled into a quiet life across the Channel. His days marked not by ambition, but by resignation. In France, he remained wealthy and secure, yet profoundly diminished. He was no longer John Balliol, King of Scots, but simply John of Balliol, a noble without a throne. The Scottish struggle for independence continued without him. Figures such as William Wallace rose to lead resistance against Edward I, embodying the defiance and courage that John had never shown. Later, Robert the Bruce would take up the cause, ultimately securing Scotland's independence. For John, these events unfolded from afar. He heard of Wallace's rebellion, of the victory at Stirling Bridge, and of the crushing defeat at Falkirk. He lived long enough to know that Robert the Bruce had emerged as a leader of true vision and determination. Yet he played no role in these struggles. His exile was not that of a king biding his time, but of a man resigned to irrelevance. This quiet exile in France was perhaps the cruelest punishment of all. In England, his humiliation had been public but finite. In France, his defeat stretched across the years, a living reminder of what had been lost. Each passing season reminded him that his throne remained occupied by others, that his people had chosen new champions, and that history was moving forward without him. The contrast was striking. While Scotland burned with rebellion and heroism, John languished in obscurity. He lived in comfort, but it was a comfort tinged with futility. No songs were sung of him, no armies rallied in his name, no people looked to him for deliverance. He was a man with the title of king, etched in memory, but stripped from reality. In this way, John's exile was a mirror of his reign. Dignified in appearance, hollow in substance. He remained alive, but politically dead. He remained wealthy, but powerless. He remained noble, but irrelevant. For Scotland, John Balliol became a forgotten figure. While Wallace and Bruce etched their names into legend, John faded into silence. His reign was remembered only as an era of weakness, his exile as proof of his failure. For John himself, the years in France must have been a slow torment. To live as a dethroned king is to carry a burden of memory heavier than chains. He had once worn the crown, but now he was reduced to watching others write the story of Scotland's freedom. His life was a shadow play of what might have been, and his throne was nothing more than a ghost in his memory. In 1314, John Balliol's long life of quiet exile came to an end. He died at his family's estate in Picardy, France, far from the land where he had once worn the crown. He was around 65 years old, an age considered remarkable for a man of his era. Yet his death passed almost unnoticed. There were no royal funerals in Scotland, no mourning processions, no songs of lament. For most of his subjects, he had already died years earlier, when Edward I had stripped him of his crown and dignity. The irony of his death lay in its timing. That very same year, Scotland achieved one of its greatest triumphs, the victory at the Battle of Bannockburn. Under the leadership of Robert the Bruce, Scottish forces dealt a devastating blow to Edward II's army, securing the momentum that would eventually ensure Scottish independence. It was the very outcome John Balliol had been powerless to achieve. The dream he had failed to embody as king while Scotland celebrated its newfound strength. John lay in the earth of a foreign land, unremembered and unwept. His life closed not with a roar of defiance, but with the silence of obscurity. He had once been crowned in Scone, hailed as the chosen king, but he died in exile, a relic of a failed chapter in his country's history. There is no great record of his funeral, no evidence of wide commemoration. For the French, he was merely another nobleman who had lived quietly in their midst. For the Scots, he was a name associated with humiliation and weakness, unworthy of reverence. The chronicles mention his death only in passing, as though his life had been little more than a shadow. And yet, his end carries a tragic resonance. Unlike Wallace, who died a martyr's death, or Bruce, who carved his legacy with victory, John Balliol's story ended in silence. His fate was not to inspire or to lead, but to be forgotten. He embodied the tragedy of a man elevated beyond his strength, destroyed by forces larger than himself, and remembered only as a warning of what happens when a king cannot be a king. His death in obscurity was a final reflection of his reign. He had been crowned in grandeur, but stripped in shame. He had been given a throne, but denied the power to rule. In the end, he left no dynasty, no great deeds, no enduring legacy. His crown had been a borrowed one, and when it was taken away, nothing remained. The Battle of Bannockburn ensured that Scotland's independence would not be forgotten. But John Balliol, the king who had once sat upon its throne, faded from memory like a ghost. He died not as a monarch, not even as a pretender, but as a man whose life had been consumed by the tragedy of weakness and dependence. The legacy of John Balliol is not one of glory or heroism, but of frailty. He is remembered not as a defender of his people, but as a puppet king, enthroned by Edward III and humiliated by him in turn. His reign stands as a cautionary tale of what happens when sovereignty is compromised from the beginning, when a crown is bestowed not by the will of a nation, but by the hand of an overlord. Yet to view him only through the lens of scorn is to overlook the deeper tragedy of his life. John Balliol was not born a tyrant, nor did he betray his people by choice. He was a man caught in the machinery of history, thrust into a role that he lacked the strength to play. His reign was doomed not by malice, but by circumstance. His life reminds us that not all kings are made by ambition or greatness. Some are made by accident, by the cruel twists of dynastic succession, and by the ambitions of others. John Balliol's fate was to wear a crown without power, to hold a throne without authority, and to endure a reign that ended in humiliation and exile. If Robert the Bruce symbolizes the triumph of Scottish resilience, John Balliol symbolizes the danger of dependence. He was the king who could not be a king, a monarch remembered not for what he did, but for what he could not do. His story is a bitter echo in Scotland's history, a reminder that sovereignty must be fought for, not handed down by foreign decree. In the end, John Balliol's diadem was nothing more than a shadow, a hollow emblem of a kingship that never truly existed. And that is perhaps the most haunting truth of his legacy. He was a king, but never a ruler.